Every athlete leaves something behind. Not just records, but moments that changed the way the game felt. Some stories are loud. This one isn't. Tonight, we slow it all down. And listen. This is The Quiet Rise of Garrett Wilson. From Lake Travis to NFL stardom, whispers of the game. The sky was still. A Texas dusk swept gently over the hills of Lake Travis. Cicadas hummed in the hush, their drones soft and steady, a lullaby for the fields. The air carried the kind of warmth that holds on long after the sun slips beneath the horizon. And somewhere in that stillness, a boy laughed. Not loud, not wild, just there, a flicker of joy in the middle of the fading day, like someone remembering a happy secret they forgot to forget. The ball danced along the grass. A spiral wobbled and fell into waiting hands. Bare feet in sun-warmed dirt. Shadows stretching longer with each throw. No scoreboard, no helmets, no coaches, just him, before the headlines, before ESPN knew his name, before draft day suits and lights that blink at you like 1,000 silent questions. There was this, space, silence, a game played under a wide, watching sky. This is not one of those stories. The ones where flash comes first, where voices drown each other out, where bravado replaces balance. Garrett Wilson's journey didn't begin with spectacle. It began in quiet, not the kind of silence that hides you, but the kind that shapes you. Like water carving stone, like breath before the leap. He walked through life, not trying to be seen, but daring to see. Not rushing toward fame, just running toward something only he knew the shape of. There was never a camera when the dream began. Only a front yard, a falling sun, a mother calling softly from the porch that dinner was ready. Chicago might have been his birthplace, steel and snow in motion. But Texas was the place that wrapped around his spirit. There, the air didn't shout. It whispered. It waited. Where the traditions were louder than the players. Where fathers stared at sons like unfinished stories. Where boys became men on Friday nights under brittle lights, watched by eyes that had seen it all before. But Garrett still felt different. Gentle, but not small. Humble, but not unsure. It's strange how some people can walk into a room and change the air, not by speaking, but by staying completely still. Like stillness is a language, and they're fluent in it. That's how his story begins. Not with a roar, but with a breath. A boy sitting on the edge of a worn-out curb. A football resting beside him. And a single question echoing softly in the dusk. What if greatness didn't have to be loud? What if it could whisper? His name was Garrett Wilson. And before the lights ever found him, before the roaring stadiums, the one-handed catches, the headlines, the pressure, he learned something deeper than speed or strength. Stillness carries its own kind of power. The kind you don't see until it moves. The kind that waits, and then runs like the wind has finally remembered where it belongs. And no one noticed. Not yet. The world was loud. But Garrett? He was just listening. Chicago was a first chapter written in gray. Cold sidewalks. Wind that sliced between buildings. The faint rattle of train tracks above. Garrett doesn't remember everything from those early years, but he remembers the echo of his father's laughter in the kitchen, the way his mother zipped him into coats that swallowed him whole, and the feeling that something bigger was always waiting just outside the window. There were snow boots by the door, and basketballs bouncing in the hall. The rhythm of the city pulsed beneath his childhood feet, and he moved with it, not knowing yet how to read the tempo, but feeling it, deep, quiet, steady. But then, it changed. Not all chapters end loudly. Some fade gently, like the city lights in the rearview mirror of a long drive south. Texas wasn't what he expected. But children don't always have the words for change. They feel it instead. The buildings slipped away. Gray turned to gold. The sky opened wider. And the rhythms he'd known were replaced by something slower, stretched out. like the drawl of voices in summer heat. Austin felt like a different kind of poem, and Lake Travis was the first place that greeted him with stillness. He didn't say much, not at first. New kids rarely do, but there was a softness to the new streets, the way the sun laid down over the pavement as if trying to welcome him. At recess, he'd watch, not out of fear, but out of curiosity, as if learning the language of the place required listening first. As if friendship could be found in the subtle space between words. He carried Chicago inside him, not in speech, not in swagger, but in something unseen. Two cities lived inside one boy. One rushed, one rested, and somewhere between them, Garrett walked. In the classrooms, he raised his hand only when needed. In the hallways, teachers noted how polite he was. And on the playground, he waited his turn, even when he knew he didn't have to. It wasn't about being right. It was about being real. Even back then, his parents noticed how he adapted, not with noise but with presence. He didn't fight for attention. He didn't beg to belong. He simply fit, like a puzzle piece finally turned the right way. At home, Lake Travis began to breathe into him. The soft hills, the winding roads, the water that stretched out beneath the bridges like time itself. He would stare at that lake for minutes that might have been hours. Not talking, not moving, just watching the way the wind brushed across the surface. Easy, still, infinite. That's how it began, really. Not with ambition, but with attention, to silence, to place, to feeling two homes beating in one chest, equally distant, equally his. He didn't yet know what he would become. But there was a steadiness early on, a sense that even as the world shifted around him, Garrett Wilson would always bring with him that blend of city steel and southern sky. He wasn't trying to be anyone new. He was learning how to carry both versions of himself without losing either. And in that quiet, you could already hear the beginning of something rare. Texas doesn't whisper when it comes to football. It watches. Every street corner, every diner booth, every corner of the high school hallway, there are expectations. Lake Travis High School didn't hand out dreams. It sharpened them. Garrett walked the halls not just as a student, not just as a new kid, but as someone who was about to wear a number, and with it, the weight of memory. Because at Lake Travis, names meant something. Some had already graced college rosters, carried Friday nights into championship weekends, etched their legacies on the turf like old initials in tree bark. People remembered, and now they would remember him too. But Garrett didn't chase legacy. He worked. In early practices, he ran routes like they were maps. As if each yard held a secret. Each cut, a question, answered only if he ran it right. The coaches noticed something, not noise, not bravado. They noticed how he moved. Not fast, fluid, not trying to impress, just trying to perfect. Teammates talked about him like a quiet tide, rising without splash. Kids different, they'd say days after the first scrimmages. Not loud, but watch him. And watch they did, because every representative Garrett ran, revealed more. It wasn't hype that followed him. It was hush. That kind of attention that makes people lean forward, not to cheer, but to understand. Coaches gave him more, faster, harder, and he took it like a student, not a star. He stayed after drills, not to show off, but because he wasn't done learning. There was no, prove them wrong, speech tucked beneath his breath. No chip on the shoulder. Only belief, quiet, deep, unshakable. He wore it like a second skin. The stands weren't full yet. Friday lights hadn't burned their mark across the season. But even then, Garrett moved like someone who knew the lights were coming, and also knew they didn't define him. The game wasn't about scoreboards. It was about moments. 1 foot in, 2 hands up, breath held midair, landing clean, and then silence. Not the thin silence of emptiness, but the thick, rich kind, the kind made of respect. He wasn't trying to be anyone else. He wasn't chasing the footsteps of names etched before him. He was making his own path, one cut at a time. At home, his parents saw it too. The way he stared at game film. Not lost in it, but listening, like he could hear the story in every angle. Football wasn't just motion, it was meditation. Lake Travis didn't change Garrett. It revealed him, slowly, layer by layer. And each Friday night under those brittle, holy lights, that revelation continued, because legacy isn't built all at once. It's built in whispers. And Garrett Wilson? He listened first. And then, he moved. The Wilson house wasn't loud. It breathed instead, steady, patterned, loving in the quiet way some homes manage without ever trying too hard. The kitchen was the heart of it. Not just for meals or clatter, but because that's where laughter lived. Dad leaned on countertops like a coach on a sideline. Always calm, watching. Mom moved through mornings with a grace that turned routine into rhythm. Lunches packed mid-sentence. Reminders given without a raised voice. There was structure, but never pressure. Not the kind that breaks, but the kind that builds. Patience, worn into the walls like paint. Garrett's father, Kenny, had once chased a different game. Not under lights, but under backboards. A hooper's soul bound by a disciplined frame. He'd played at Davidson, a dream he touched, held, and learned to let go when the next chapter called. That experience didn't make him bitter. It made him wiser. He never demanded Garrett be great. He only asked that he be honest, with his work, his choices, himself. There were no speeches about grind. Just consistency. Homework before film. Chores before cleats. Respect before ambition. Love filled the place, not through noise, but presence. Dinner was sacred. No distractions, only dialogue. Even on slow days, they'd sit, check in, pass the salt, ask questions. Not just about grades or practices, but feeling. How'd it feel out there today? What did you see? What did you learn? The questions beneath the questions. Garrett didn't always have the words. But he listened. And later, when he ran sprints, or lined up wide, or waited in quiet pre-game stillness, those questions echoed again. Even his silence had texture. In the living room, sports were watched like film. Not for fandom, but for form. Kenny would pause replays, rewind until patterns appeared, routes, spacing, timing. Also Garrett could see things others might miss. You don't always have to be first, he'd say. You just have to be right. Family came with expectations. Never about fame. Always about integrity. His mother, Candace, kept everything grounded. Her love was firm, rooted in care, but unwavering. She guarded Garrett's softness, not to keep it hidden, but to remind him it wasn't a weakness. Garrett's siblings mirrored the rhythm. Laughter, competition, small fights that faded quickly. They sharpened each other without cutting. And when the porch light flicked on in the evening, when winter dipped just enough to cool the air across Austin's hills, Garrett would sometimes sit outside alone. Ball in hand, back against old wood, the faint murmur of the TV through the walls. His mom on a call. His dad upstairs organizing shoes by color. And all of it, the ordinary, it stitched together a foundation. A family that didn't force dreams, but welcomed them. A house where love wasn't loud, but lasting. And in that stillness, soaked in warmth and measured encouragement, Garrett slowly learned what kind of man, and what kind of athlete, he wanted to become. Not the kind who rushed. The kind who rose. It didn't arrive like thunder. No headlines. No sudden leap. It was quiet. A shift so subtle that only those really paying attention noticed. But it was there. Junior year. The space where boys begin to stretch toward the men they might become. Garrett stepped onto that field as he always had, low-key, ready, eyes soft beneath the helmet. But something had settled inside him. Or maybe, something had finally awakened. The roots came cleaner, crisper. Feet dancing just shy of the line, shoulders tilting with the wisdom of timing. He wasn't running anymore. He was gliding. Coaches exchanged glances, not the surprised kind, but the startled kind. Because progress is expected. But this was something else. He'd catch a slant and float from contact. He'd cut without telegraphing, drawing defenders into moves he'd already left behind. Some called it athleticism, but it wasn't just that. It was awareness, a kind of breath between the motion, a stillness even within the speed. Teammates started watching differently. They used his name more often. Coaches drew more plays in the margins, routes built around him. Recruiters began to whisper, not with exclamation marks but with ellipses. Have you seen the kid at Lake Travis? There's this junior, quiet, but... Numbers started owning space on stat sheets. But Garrett never led with stats. He led with rhythm, finding a lane, a seam, a floating fade that curved like it knew where he'd be before he did. After practices, he stayed. Not to be seen, but because something in him wasn't done. Film sessions became obsession, not in a frantic way, but like studying constellations. Like tracking stars across skyfilm looking for new shapes. At night, he still sat with earbuds in, ball spinning slowly in his hands. Replaying reps in his head, fingers mimicking the catch, the foot drag, the pivot. People started talking. Offers began landing. Texas? Oklahoma? Ohio State? He listened. He nodded. He waited. Because Garrett wasn't chasing something. He was growing into it. Bit by bit. Cut by cut. Catch by quiet catch. By the end of junior year, it wasn't a matter of if, but when, and where. Even then, Garrett never called himself ready. But the dream? It had stopped whispering. Now, it was humming. Low, clear, inevitable. And the boy who never demanded attention found the spotlight moving toward him anyway. Not because he asked for it, but because he'd earned it. With grace, with stillness, with the kind of work that doesn't seek a stage, but builds one. The letters came quietly at first. A few folded envelopes tucked between geometry tests and hallway chatter. School counselors nodded with knowing smiles. Coaches clapped his shoulder, as if to say, "It's really happening now." Then the letters turned into visits. Conversations. Camp invites. Hands extended, pictures taken. College gear wrapped in ambition. A carousel of programs, each promising legacy. But Garrett remained still in the center of all that motion. He listened more than he spoke. Smiled more than he shouted. Wore each interaction like a tailored suit, respectful and reserved, never oversized. Recruiters traded stories like secrets. He doesn't celebrate much. No, he just catches. It wasn't that he lacked excitement. He simply didn't need it to be loud. He was searching, still. Not just for the best offer, but the right resonance. The one that felt true. Family weighed in, softly. Advice came not as directives but as reminders. "Don't chase a name," his father said one night, low in tone and full of care. "Chase the fit." And Garrett did. He watched games, not just for style but for substance. Watched how receivers moved in space on Saturdays. Noticed which ones were decoys, which ones were empowered. How often the pocket held, how often coaches trusted. Some names rose quickly. Texas, USC, Oklahoma, each with its own kind of gravity, each offering a chance to shine on big stages. But one stood apart, colder in climate, richer in legacy. Ohio State. Snow dusted the air the day he visited. It clung to his shoes and settled on his shoulders like a sign. The facilities spoke loudly. Tradition echoed in the bricks and the faces that lined the walls. But Garrett wasn't intimidated. He felt spoken to. There, the silence wasn't absence, it was reverence. A kind of still honor humming beneath everything. And he knew. Not because of the nil talk. Not because of the uniforms or the hype videos. But because something inside him rested when he walked that campus. A place that hadn't promised him the world, but had asked him to help shape it. When he committed, there was no press conference. Just a quiet decision cast into the world like a stone into still water. The ripples came quickly. Breaking news, ranking shifts, analysts circling his name with bolder ink. But Garrett didn't change. He shrugged at the noise, tightened his laces, and quietly finished his senior year. Because for all the buzz, all the stories, all the projections, he knew he hadn't proven anything yet. The work wasn't done. The story hadn't started. It was simply time to turn the page. The snow didn't shout in Columbus. It drifted, quiet, deliberate. Garrett had seen winter before. Chicago left enough of it in his memory. But this time, it felt older. Heavier. Like a silence he hadn't learned how to speak yet. He arrived to campus with a duffel bag in the same way he always entered new spaces, calm, curious, unassuming. The walls of Ohio State whispered legacy. Faces in black and white photos looked down like they were waiting to see if he belonged. And Garrett didn't flinch. He nodded to each one, as if making a promise. The early mornings came quickly. Lift, meetings, roots on frozen grass. His breath visible now, hanging between words and reps. His hands stiff at first in the cold, then learned to warm the ball like it was second nature. There were older names ahead of him. Bigger voices. Players who strutted in wide arcs and laughed like they were already written into the annals. Garrett stayed on the edge of rooms. Listened, learned, took notes. You'd mistake his quiet for hesitation if you weren't paying close enough attention. But it wasn't nerves. It was presence. The coaches didn't feed him expectations. They tested him, slowly, precisely. Small reps in early practices. Low-pressure drills meant for observation more than evaluation. Still, Garrett treated each one like it mattered. Not to prove anything, but to understand everything. He asked questions with his eyes more than his mouth. Watched hand placement. Watched route angles. Watched how defenders leaned one way before they cut another. He was building a library before he ever touched the field. And when he finally did, it wasn't headlines. It was harmony, clean breaks, subtle hands, the kind of catches that don't make noise, but they move chains. Upperclassmen began saying his name more easily. He's smooth, smart, too, knows when to disappear. And in a depth chart full of voices jockeying for air, Garrett's stillness began to ring out. Not as absence, as promise. He wasn't chasing playing time with brashness. He was earning trust brick by brick. Weight room, film room, locker room, each space he entered the same way, unrushed. Ready. The cold no longer bit. It built, and Garrett began shaping his rhythm within it. Not a Texas rhythm, not a Midwest rhythm, just his own. And in the huddled days of those first Ohio winters, when flesh met frost and breath fogged visors, Garrett found something quiet and firm waking up inside him. Not stardom, something older than that, belonging. They said he made catches look easy. But easy isn't the right word. It never was. What Garrett did couldn't be simplified. It wasn't casual or effortless. It was precise, measured, like music played in a silent room, notes falling exactly where they should, never louder than necessary. The ball didn't just fall into his hands. It found him, always, like something unseen had drawn a line from quarterback to fingertips, and everything in between was just a formality. It wasn't that defenders didn't try. They did, eyes locked, feet quick, hands desperate, but Garrett existed in a different clock. One tick ahead, 1 second sooner. He didn't outrun people. He outtimed them. People began noticing. Saturdays brought attention. And Garrett met it the same way he met every route, with humility. With focus. With a calm tethered to something deeper than hype. Reporters asked questions. What's it like to make plays like that? He'd nod, smile, offer answers that filled the air but never the whole room. Because the truth lived in the tape. In the slow motion of sideline grabs, toe drags balanced like punctuation marks at the end of long beginnings. Fans started using words like natural, like graceful. But to Garrett, it wasn't grace. It was preparation becoming art. Practice, repeated. Patterns, absorbed. Routes, memorized not as script, but as instinct. No route too simple. No throw beneath him. He didn't sprint. He slipped, through gaps, between steps, under attention. Even his celebrations were subtle. A nod. A jog back to the huddle. A hand extended to lift a fellow teammate from the turf. Because this wasn't about spotlight. It was about sequence. And sequence, when lived fully, becomes something close to poetry. The coaches adjusted, used him more, leaned in, asked more of him and less of the playbook. Teammates trusted him. Quarterbacks looked his way even when they shouldn't have, because Garrett was there. Where he was supposed to be. Always. And if he wasn't open at the snap, he would be in 2 more steps. That was his rhythm, not fast. But perfect. And still, no one word defined him. Not yet. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He wasn't built like a story waiting to be told. He was undeniable. Not just a receiver. A rhythm. A pattern. A presence that made the air feel different when the ball left the quarterback's hand. Like everyone knew where it was going, and why. And each Saturday, as fans rose from seats, as voices burst into air thick with hope, as the ball spun its way toward him, Garrett didn't leap. He lifted, like a thought remembered, like a hush turning to a heartbeat. And the world, watching quietly, took note. Not just of what he did, but of how he made it feel. They didn't ask. They told him, "You're moving to the slot." And Garrett nodded. No protest. No pause. Just that quiet agreement he carried into every transition, an understanding that growth often whispers, and when it does, you listen. To most, the move might have felt like a demotion. A detour. Outside guys chase glory. Slot receivers grind. But Garrett? He didn't see position. He saw puzzle. The field didn't get smaller, it got deeper. Layers of defenders. More traffic. More reads. Timing tighter than ever. He studied it like new sheet music. Where timing wasn't just important, it was survival. He learned how to hesitate just long enough. How to vanish behind a linebacker. How to turn hips into highways. Inside, everything came faster. But Garrett stayed slow, in the way that great jazz walks, never hurried, always exact. Footwork compressed. Vision widened. Back then, it wasn't about how fast you could run. It was how smart you could disappear. Quarterbacks noticed first. Trust bloomed under pressure. Because Garrett would be there. Quick out on 3rd and short. Slant across a crowd. Rub route timed to the beat in his chest. He adapted, not just to space, but to weight. Blocking came with it. Releases against hands that jabbed, grabbed, shoved. He absorbed it all. Adjusted leverage. Learned to lean without breaking. Inside routes aren't always pretty. But Garrett made them beautiful. Where others forced movement, he bent it. He became a mirror to defenders, reflecting what they gave, then reshaping it into something softer, sharper, unstoppable. Coaches stopped calling plays for a position. They called plays for a presence. He wasn't the X. He wasn't the Z. He was a solution in motion. Fans didn't notice it at first, the switch. Too nuanced, too quiet, but those who knew, knew. It was in the way the offense tilted toward him. In the way defenses began shadowing him differently. Because now, he wasn't just running routes. He was controlling tempo. Watch the tape. Watch how he moved defenders with just his eyes. See how his steps told one story, while his purpose told another. He was mapping space with intention. Filling empty yards with elegance. Every route had a rhythm, and Garrett found the downbeat without fail. His stats didn't spike. His smile didn't widen. But something internal did. A private sense that he could become anything the game required. Outside. Inside, short, deep, he belonged in all of it. Because greatness doesn't settle in one place on the field. It stretches, it studies, it evolves. And Garrett Wilson? He evolved, silently, like music written in lowercase. Sometimes the sky turned cold in Columbus, even when games were still warm. Garrett knew how to win quietly. But losses, they arrived with a different silence. One that sat heavier. That didn't leave when the fans walked out or the lights blinked off. It wasn't that he hadn't known defeat before. Every athlete does. But in college, losses carried a different kind of loneliness. Because you don't just lose a scoreboard. You lose moments, trust, momentum, the breath between progress. And Garrett felt each one. In some games, the margin wasn't much. A possession, a misread, a missed block that became a touchdown the other way. The locker room after those nights didn't echo. It listened. People say character shows in adversity. Garrett never made speeches. He never looked for someone to blame. He just sat, uniform untucked, gloves half off, eyes rarely lifted, not in shame, but in thought. He turned plays over in his mind like poetry scribbled margins deep. How did the safety bite? Was the timing off? Could that shuffle step at the break point have been quicker? Outside, reporters looked for answers in stats. Garrett searched for answers in angles. Sometimes, he showed up the next day without a word. First on the field, first in the film room, moving through drills like the loss was still in his lungs, not suffocating him, just reminding him. It wasn't just about redemption. It was about refining. He learned that defeat is a kind of teacher that never raises its voice. That its lessons show up in the quiet moments, when no one's filming, when no one's posting. Teammates noticed. He didn't sulk. He absorbed. He listened harder in meetings. Stayed longer after practice. Asked questions that had nothing to do with receptions, and everything to do with role. What did I miss in coverage? Should I have flattened that dig? What did the corner show when I stacked him? The answers weren't always satisfying. But learning rarely is. Some fans questioned. That was natural. Not about his talent, but about his emergence. Why didn't he take more control in tough moments? But Garrett wasn't wired for ego. He didn't break plays to prove points. He stuck with structure. Trusted the call. Argued only with tape, not tone. Because he believed in the long arc. And in that belief, he found something most never see during the lows. Growth. The kind that doesn't fill stat lines. The kind that shapes trajectory. By the season's end, when shoulders sag and knees grow tight, Garrett hadn't just played hard. He'd learned to be present in pain. To stay calm in chaos. To find the signal inside the noise. And that next time he lined up, cleats scraping turf, breath short, defenders reading his step, he didn't think about stats. He thought about sequence, about lesson, about being just a little better than the last time the world closed in. Because losses don't define legacies. But they do. Refine them. Quietly. Deliberately. Like wind shaping stone. And Garrett Wilson? He let that wind do its work. It didn't feel final. Walking off that field. The horseshoe behind him. The echoes of Saturdays still hanging in the air. It didn't feel like goodbye. Not quite. Not yet. Garrett didn't do dramatic endings. No waving to the crowd. No stashed signs or secret gestures. He jogged off like he always did. Purposeful. Shoulders forward. But something in the way he glanced at the end zone, just once, said enough. Seasons don't end with clocks. They end when something inside you gives quiet permission to move forward. For Garrett, that permission came slowly. He'd been thinking, for weeks, listening closely to the silence between play calls, measuring not just what he wanted, but who he was becoming. The NFL had been circling. Analysts, scouts, agents, well-dressed voices with fancier words than truth. They kept saying things like, your stock, your ceiling, it's time. But Garrett didn't decide based on momentum. He decided based on meaning. Was he ready? Not for lights, not for money, but for weight. The kind that came with being expected to carry something farther than before. He thought about his teammates. The locker room laughter. The inside jokes about film study and frostbitten fingers. The long walks back to the dorm after practice. All of it still clung to him. But so did the feeling that he couldn't stay. Not because he wanted to leave, but because something deeper said it was time. There were no announcement videos. Just a conversation. With his coaches. With his family. With the version of himself that had arrived here 3 years earlier, improved, quiet, open. He thought about that freshman. The one who stood at the back of the drills. Who ran every route like it was a question, not an answer. And he realized, he wasn't that kid anymore. The routes had become sharper. The silence had become leadership. The presence had become pattern. He still didn't yell, still didn't boast, but he had built something real. Sometimes, leaving isn't about loss. It's about stewardship, of the game, of the gift, of the next step waiting in its own kind of stillness. So Garrett declared, quietly, without ceremony. Just a statement posted to a screen. Grateful words. Steady eyes. Thank you, Buckeye Nation. No fanfare. No flash. Just future. Laid plain. And in that choice, the same calm moved through him that had been his rhythm all along. This wasn't the end. Not for Ohio State. Not for him. It was the space between chapters. And Garrett, pen in hand, past in heart, was ready to write the next. The room wasn't silent, not really, but it felt like it. Voices murmured in the background, analysts, agents, families. There were lights, reflections bouncing off glass tables, soft laughter trying to quiet nerves. Suits folded over knees, watches checked like clocks might change fate. Garrett sat still, his phone upside down on the cushion beside him. His name waiting somewhere in the night. The draft was a strange combination of control and surrender. You do everything, run, lift, catch, speak, perform, and then you sit. You wait, and whatever happens next, isn't in your hands. Pick by pick, minutes slipping by like folded paper left in a breeze. Some players joked, others fidgeted, some disappeared into phone calls, pretending not to look tense. Garrett watched, not obsessively, calm, present, because the work had already been done. The routes run, the film made, the visits taken. Now it was a matter of timing. Not everything in life is loud. Some of the biggest moments arrive like mail in the morning, unfolding quietly, piece by piece. His family was with him. Their presence grounding, like the porch light turned on back home. His father, calm-eyed. His mother, holding strength in her stillness. No one said much. And then, it came. A slight vibration. A name on the screen. A nod from someone across the room. And just like that, the stillness broke. Not in celebration. Not in chaos. In breath. The kind of breath you take before something begins. New York. The Jets. A city that doesn't rest. A franchise that needed something true, not another promise, but presence. Garrett smiled, not big. Just enough. He hugged the people who mattered most. Let the cameras do what cameras do. Let the moment land quietly in his chest. Not a dream fulfilled, a responsibility accepted. The commissioner called his name. And for a flash, the world looked at him. The young man in a gray suit. Walking to a stage like someone stepping into the fog with nothing but clarity in his step. Confetti didn't fall. This wasn't a finish line. It was a door. He shook the hand extended to him. Lifted the jersey. Posed with numbers and names. But behind the smile, behind the lenses and flashing bulbs, a promise formed, not to be a star. To be steady. To build something that lasts. That rises slow and holds firm. Later that night, away from cameras, away from microphones, he sat again, quiet, thoughtful. the same way he always had. The streets outside buzzed with taxis, with life. But inside, Garrett just took it in. The moment, the next step, the weight of being chosen, and the responsibility of choosing it back. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. Because the silence, that same silence that shaped him, was now his strength. The city didn't care who he was. It blinked at him with yellow cabs and billboards, with crosswalks that never slept and voices layered over sirens like music made of movement. New York, loud, alive, impatient. And Garrett? He arrived as he always had. Quiet, still, observing more than announcing. The skyline rose around him like ambition in steel form, tall, impossible, necessary. But he didn't flinch. He didn't perform. Instead, he walked, ears open, shoulders loose, like someone meeting a challenge with a handshake instead of a battle cry. The Jets handed him a playbook. Thick pages, dense language, shapes and numbers and code. Garrett took it like scripture. Not to be memorized for praise, but understood for rhythm. Because Sundays were coming fast. Rookie camp began with a hum. Not chaotic, but heavy. Lanes filled with nerves. Reps stacked with purpose. Coaches watching everything and saying little. And Garrett moved through it all like breath, contained, considered, calm. His locker was neat. His helmet lined with thin silence between goalposts of expectation. Teammates tested him, not cruelly, just curiously. Let's see what the kid does. And Garrett? He did what he always did. Ran clean, cut exact, eyes locked like a compass refusing to shake its needle. No extra celebration, no casual nods, just execution traced in sweat. Off the field, New York pressed in, but Garrett did not press back. When traffic screamed, he listened. When schedules stacked meetings over moments, he made time fit where it could. Coffee alone, walks on streets unnamed, head down but not hidden, absorbing everything. People might have mistaken his quiet for hesitation. But Garrett had learned long ago that quiet is not lack. It's attention. In huddles, veterans asked if he understood the checks. He'd nod, repeat steps in his head. Look once more at the root tree beside his locker. Then go run it, cleaner than before. Film rooms became familiar. The fast-forward button, a friend. Patterns flickered before his eyes until they stopped being patterns and started being expectation. Because Garrett wasn't trying to survive. He was trying to belong. He didn't chase city lights. He chased the silence beneath the noise. That space where greatness grows, not from fame, but from form. Where trust gets built in blocks of routes well run, and weeks well studied. The media asked him what it felt like. To come from soft Texas hills to this empire. He smiled, small, said he was grateful, said he was focused. What he meant was, he was listening, to the city, to the team, to the quiet inside himself that had never left. And in that silence, he found his way. The locker room was quiet in its own kind of way. Not silent, there were voices, footsteps, the low murmur of music, but underneath it all, there was attention. Not fear, not nerves, reverence. Sunday had come. Garrett sat alone on the bench for a moment, socks half pulled over ankles, palms resting on his knees. His eyes weren't wide, they were focused, drawing in everything without flinching. The jersey hung behind him, clean, untouched. But soon, it would carry sweat. Marks. A story he'd waited his entire life to begin. He didn't speak much. Didn't need to. This wasn't about words. This was about the space between footsteps down a tunnel. About the breath taken before stepping into light. When he stood, it was easy. No bounds. No swagger. Just purpose in motion. Out on the field, the air buzzed. Not loud like some expected, but charged, like something had been waiting for him. The crowd roared, but Garrett only heard what he needed to hear. The cadence of the moment, the pulse of the present. He lined up for the first time and looked across. A veteran corner stared back, chin lifted, eyes narrowing. Garrett didn't blink, didn't mouth off, just set his stance and waited for the snap. When it came, he moved, smooth, clipped, without excess. No wasted step, no hesitation. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He was fitting a key into a door. One route, one cut, one turn of the wrist at a time. The ball came, midway through the third quarter. Out of a tight window, slipping between defenders, timing raised on trust. And Garrett caught it, not dramatic, not diving, just hands where they needed to be, body curled around the moment like he belonged inside it. 8 yards, a first down. It wouldn't show up in highlight reels. But for him, it was a beginning. Not of his career, exactly. But of the understanding that everything before, the backyard throws, the high school lights, the tape, the silence, the work, had led here and fit perfectly. Back on the sideline, a coach patted his helmet. Garrett nodded once, then turned his attention back to the field. Because there was more to do. More to say with roots than with words. He wasn't chasing records. He wasn't asking for shine. He was stepping, with quiet resolve, into the rhythm of the league. And somewhere, deep beneath the noise, the boy from the curb, ball at his side, hearing the game before anyone else did, smiled, just a little, because this wasn't the dream fulfilled. This was the dream, unfolding. They came fast. Veteran corners with eyes like chess players. Jams at the line that arrived like thunder, hands clawing, feet cutting off space before Garrett could even shape a route. They weren't just defending space. They were declaring territory. And Garrett, rookie, soft-spoken, sharp-eyed, just listened. Not to their trash talk or the noise spilling from sidelines. He listened to their feet. He learned the way one corner leaned too heavy on his inside hip. How another blinked just before he bit a slant. He cataloged tells, small ones, quiet signs that most receivers never caught. He wasn't stronger, not yet, but he was smarter, quieter in his study, slower in his frustration. He didn't fire back. He filed information. Some matchups bruised him, press coverage that hung on too long. Arms stronger than any he'd faced before. Collisions that echoed, but pain didn't rattle Garrett. It refined him. Each representative became a test. Not pass or fail, just adapt or don't. And Garrett, breath held in film rooms, eyes narrowed in meetings, adapted like water finding cracks. He started selling fakes one step earlier. Picking tempo not based on route trees but defender rhythm. Disguising movements in repetition until sudden cuts left defenders leaning the wrong way. They weren't highlights. They were changes in gravity. He wasn't faster than them. But he was faster than their memories. What they thought he would do, he already wasn't doing. Coaches noticed first. Subtle things. He came back to the ball sharper. Shed contact without widening. Took hits, popped back up, barely nodded. Quarterbacks noticed after. Because Garrett was where the ball needed him, even when the play broke. Especially then. And veteran corners? They stopped talking as much. Started watching. Because somewhere between week 1 and week whatever, it shifted. The rookie wasn't surviving anymore. He was scripting. Routes not with flash, but with timing. Catches not with arrogance, but with mastery. Everything in him, the quiet, the study, the stillness, had met this moment. And slowly, week by week, the league began adjusting to him. But he was already adjusting again. Not loudly, but like he always had. Studying chaos, and becoming calm. The season ended not with a roar, but a quiet closing of the locker door. Garrett sat alone for a moment, tape still clinging to his wrists, cleats loose like strings pulled on a long day. The stadium emptied slowly. The year had given him everything, and taken more than most could see. He didn't chase headlines, but one had found him. Offensive Rookie of the Year. They announced it like a ceremony. Applause. graphics, broadcast anchors with polished voices. But Garrett received it the same way he played, grounded, steady, respectful of the moment without needing to perform for it. He smiled, gently, not surprised, not overwhelmed, more like someone hearing news he had quietly prepared his whole life to deserve. The plaque would be mailed home. He wasn't in it for trophies. He was in it for truth. And what the award really said wasn't that he'd arrived, even though some would insist on calling it that. It said he had built something real. There was no shortcut to this. No leap of luck. Just steps, one after another, layered on silence, repetition, and the slow mastery of hard things. The plays that defined his year weren't always the big ones. They were the checkdowns, run after catch. The pivot routes in muddy coverage. The trust built in red zone slants. Body in the way, hands in the right place, presence like gravity. The game slowed for him, not because it became easier, but because he became clearer. And people noticed, not just inside the franchise, but everywhere. Young receivers in high school watched his tape with pause and rewind reverence. Noting the way he set up defenders. How his head barely moved, but his hips told lies defenders believed. They admired the small things. The quiet things. Because Garrett's season reminded them, you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to be honest. In your roots. In your work. In the way you show up, every Sunday, calm under a helmet that hides the eyes but not the heart. His family kept the texts private. He knew what they meant without opening them. Pride doesn't always need volume. And back home, where the hills of Lake Travis still held the echo of his early steps, a different kind of celebration unfolded. Not banners or parties, just a porch light left on. A quiet glance at the TV. A father's laugh that lingered longer than usual. A hometown reminded of what grace under pressure looks like, when it grows up. He'd won, but more than that, he'd endured, and that matters more than most people ever say. Because trophies catch the light. But the work is what glows in the dark. The off-season didn't feel like rest. It felt like pause. The kind that asks questions more than it offers peace. For Garrett, the headlines didn't matter much. Breakout star, face of the offense. They were words, floating above real work that still had to happen in quiet hours, long before September called again. New York breathed heat in the summer. Subways pulsed, concrete shimmered, and inside it all, Garrett trained. Not for show, but for shift. He rewatched film, not just his own plays, but blocking schemes, quarterback mechanics, routes that never got thrown but still mattered. Because being great once wasn't enough. He wanted to be necessary. There were weights, yes. Sprints. Root trees run on empty fields where the echoes were sweat and breath alone. But just as important were the meetings. The new faces walking into the building. A new quarterback. One whose name meant history. One whose throws weren't just passes, they were expectations wearing a spiral. Garrett didn't flinch. He didn't brag. He listened. Introduced himself with handshake and eye contact, not resume. Respect isn't claimed. It's given in return. And slowly, timing began to form. In drills, in silent glances, in shoulder shimmies before the snap. Chemistry can't be forced, but Garrett had something better than charm. He had care. Every representative became a conversation, unsaid but understood. He ran like rhythm, adjusted mid-route, shifted leverage by instinct, and the throws began finding him. Not because he waved his hands, but because he was exactly where he should be. Coaches started smiling more in meetings. Whispers floated down hallways. They've got something. But Garrett didn't let it swell. He stayed rooted, one representative at a time, one conversation at a time. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk the city in silence. Hood up, phone untouched, just letting the weight of what was building settle on him. Because this was different now. This wasn't about being the promising young receiver. This was about what came after promise. Pressure, process, possibility. Fans watched training camp footage and clipped out the catches. The sideline stays. The quick twitch releases off the line. But what they didn't see, the early mornings with notes in hand. The moments between reps spent adjusting hand placement. Talking through timing with rookies, veterans, coaches alike. That part wasn't for highlight reels. It was for growth. And Garrett grew. Not bigger, wider. In understanding. In role. In essence. No longer just a receiver. But a core. Of the team. Of the trust. Of the vision quietly taking shape beneath it all. Fall was coming. Expectations, louder than ever. But Garrett? He heard something else altogether. Readiness. The kind that doesn't raise a hand. Just runs the route, and makes the catch. Again. And again. Until everyone else starts catching up to what he's already known. He's only getting started. The second the season started, the air changed. Something about the way the ball cut through the September sky. The way the crowd leaned forward just a little more when Garrett stepped to the line. He felt it, not in a loud announcement of self, but in the growing quiet that happens when expectation becomes belief. The chemistry had taken root in the offseason. Now, it showed. Roots snapped sharper. Timing synced like second hands meeting at the top of the hour. Quarterback eyes found him not by design, but by trust. Because Garrett was open, not by chance, but by craft. Inside leverage, outside release. The smallest tells from the defense, and he was already writing his own answer before the play unfolded. And with each game, those answers started stacking. Catches in traffic, breaks in the red zone, third downs that looked unlikely, until they weren't. He didn't dance. He didn't shout. He just lowered his head after the whistle and trotted back like a man preparing for the next question. And when the big games came, the lights, the rivalries, the weight of records, he did exactly what he always had. He listened. To coverage. To footsteps. To the breath of a stadium just before the snap. And then he moved. Not loud. Not wild. Just right. Corners began watching film differently. Defensive coordinators shifted schemes, rolled brackets, flipped safeties his way, but Garrett adjusted. He'd go quiet a quarter, draw attention away. Then reappear in the middle of the field, hands extended like punctuation. The plays weren't always flashy. Some were sideline toe taps, others short curls that turned into long gains. But every single one had weight. Because they came at the moments that mattered. Games on the line, drives needing breath, and Garrett giving it, again and again. And in the locker room, something changed too. Younger players asked questions now. Watched how he taped his wrists. How he nodded in meetings but wrote nothing down. How he walked the same after a win, after a loss, after a game-winning drive. He wasn't just producing, he was proving. That stillness under pressure is more than a mindset. It's a weapon. Journalists started writing features. Opposing coaches mentioned him by name. Broadcasters leaned into replays with phrases like, "He just gets open." But Garrett didn't flinch, didn't look up, because the goal was never to be celebrated. It was to be counted on. Each route, each quarter, each week. And as the season unfolded, slowly and suddenly, he became not just a piece of the offense. He became its rhythm, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. With patience, with poise, with the kind of presence that doesn't ask for space, but creates it. There's a moment in every athlete's journey when the external noise becomes heavier than the internal rhythm. Praise swells like tidewater. Expectations loom like unfinished skylines. And suddenly, being good enough isn't the question, staying grounded is. Garrett felt it, not in interviews or highlight reels, but in the quiet after them. In the untouched hours when the camera turns off and the pads come off and you are no longer a name printed across screens, but just someone trying to stay whole. He still studied tape, but now with more weight behind every frame. Not just how to win his route, but how to protect his body. How to last, how to lead. The season had matured with storm and clarity. Injuries happened, not just to him, but around him. Teammates went down, lineups shifted, systems bent, some games unraveled before they ever found rhythm. And still, Garrett kept running. Kept showing up in the huddle with that same still gaze, that same firm nod. His numbers stayed steady, but numbers were never who he was. It was the blocking on gadget plays. The way he pulled defenders to open space for others. The subtle hand signals before motion. The calm he brought when the game twisted out of rhythm. Coaches began coming to him, not with directions, but with decisions. What are you seeing out there? What do you like on third down? He didn't shout plays or rattle off jargon. He just looked out at the field, saw the space, and described it like a painter explaining light. Veterans nodded. Younger players leaned closer. To them, Garrett had become more than a receiver. He was a measure of consistency, of presence, of the rhythm an offense finds when chaos presses from every angle, and the right player finds the breath between pressure. Outside, rumors spun. Could he be the next? The next great, the next contract, the next face of the franchise? Garrett shrugged. Not disinterested, just aligned differently. He wasn't building a brand. He was building a foundation. His weeks blurred into each other. Mondays in film, Tuesdays on grass, Wednesdays under sky. A cycle of repetition that held him in balance. And underneath it all, beneath the catches and the coverages and the conversation, he still carried that quiet question from the very beginning. Am I serving the game, or chasing what it brings? Every time he ran a route with detail, every time he caught in traffic and helped someone else up after, he answered it. He was serving the team, the craft, the smallest moments that no one replays, but that every victory depends on. And in doing so, he reminded those watching, the fans, the scouts, the hopeful young receivers, that greatness isn't about making the most noise. It's about becoming the player who makes things work, even when nothing is perfect. Especially then, because the best don't rise above the game. They settle deeper into it. And Garrett Wilson? He was right where he needed to be. Some legacies arrive fast, floodlit and fierce. Others arrive like dusk. Soft, gradual, impossible to ignore, even without fanfare. Garrett's wasn't written in a single night. Not in one play. Not even in one season. It was traced slowly, through repetitions, quiet faith, winds whispered beneath breaths, and losses carried with grace. And now, some people are starting to ask, what will he become? A leader? A star? A legend? But those words, truthfully, they've never held much weight for Garrett. Not compared to the ones he's carried since the beginning. Words like consistency, honor, presence. Inside the huddle, there's no need for speeches. He looks his teammates in the eye, aligns his stance, and shows up, again and again. Same pace, same focus, same curve in the route, no matter the score. Because for him, greatness isn't what others say about you. It's how you show up when no one's looking. In the cold, in the wind, in the quiet after the crowd leaves. And in that quiet, that same quiet from Chicago sidewalks, from Lake Travis Hills, from locker rooms and meeting rooms and sleepless nights, he is still listening. To the game, to himself, to the calling that doesn't need to shout to be heard. The future will bring what it will, more accolades, more defenders fallen behind him, more catches fitting perfectly into the rhythm of a moment. But Garrett won't chase legacy. He'll live it, route by route, step by step, silence into movement. Some receivers demand the spotlight. Garrett? He turns it into gravity. And as season after season unfolds, as records rise and new names appear, the story of Garrett Wilson will continue the way it always has. Quietly, deliberately, unshakably. Not because he was made to be seen, but because he was made to be trusted.